Only one lamp was lit in the wedding room. The warm yellow light fell at the foot of the bed, like a thin layer of gauze. Stella sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clutching the hem of her skirt, her knuckles white. Jake leaned against the doorframe, his tie already loosened, 2 buttons of his shirt undone. He looked at her without saying a word. She lifted her head, her eyes meeting his, then quickly darting away. She began to sign. Her movements were swift, her fingers carving sharp arcs through the air. "I want to sleep in separate rooms." Jake understood. Of course he did. He had spent 3 years learning sign language, not so he could fail to understand her now. He let out a laugh. Not the polite social kind, but one that rolled from deep in his throat. Lazy, dangerous. He walked over. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Stella shrank back, but the bed was only so big. Where could she go? He stood before her and leaned down. One hand braced beside her, the other cupped her chin, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. Her eyes were glistening like a startled fawn, yet also like the way she used to look down at him when she pinned him in the mud as a child. Only back then, her eyes held arrogance. Now, they held panic. "Little mute," he murmured, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw. "Dream on." Her eyes widened, and she raised her hands to sign, but he directly pressed them down. "You owe me," he said, his voice low, as if ground out from deep in his chest. "For the rest of your life you'll pay it back, bit by bit." She struggled a little, not with much force, or rather, she didn't really put any effort into it. He pulled her into his arms, tightening his hold, his chin resting on the top of her head. She froze for a moment, then stopped moving. Jake caught the scent of her hair. Gardenias. She had loved gardenias since childhood, always stuffing a handful into his pocket during summer when they were young, saying, "Here, don't you dare lose them." He closed his eyes. A breeze drifted in through the window, making the curtain sway gently. He thought back to something from many years ago. That year he was 10 and she was 9. The Xia family was hosting a banquet, the courtyard filled with adults clinking glasses and chatting, with no one noticing the boy in worn-out clothes tucked away in the corner. He crouched by the flower bed, watching ants move their colony, not out of boredom but because he had nowhere else to go. His mother was a maid for the Xia family, and he had been brought along because there was no one to look after him. Then she appeared, the little princess of the Xia family, wearing a puffy dress, a bow tied in her hair, and holding a lollipop in her hand, rushing over like a gust of wind. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer. "I asked what you're doing." She jabbed the lollipop in front of his face. "Are you deaf?" He looked up at her for a moment, then lowered his head again. She was displeased. The little princess never allowed anyone to ignore her. She stomped her foot on the back of his hand. He flinched in pain but didn't make a sound. "Why aren't you saying anything?" She crouched down, tilting her head to look at him. "Are you mute?" He didn't say a word. "Then from now on, I'll call you Little Mute." She stood up, dusting off her skirt, then suddenly crouched down again, leaning close to his ear. "But it's okay, Little Mute. From now on, I'll protect you. Whoever bullies you, I'll beat them up." When she said that, her eyes sparkled like stars in the sky. At that moment, he thought this girl was both fierce and annoying. Later, he realized that was called a crush. Stella slowly relaxed in his arms. Her breathing became steady, and her body was no longer stiff. She was tired. The entire day of the wedding, she had been paraded around like a display piece, smiling until her face went numb, standing until her feet ached. Everyone looked at her with pity. The poor mute daughter of the Xia family, married off to Jake, a man rumored to be after the Xia family's power. She knew what people said. She knew everything. She just couldn't speak. Jake waited until her breathing was completely steady before slowly releasing his hand, laying her back on the pillow, and pulling the covers over her. He sat on the edge of the bed, watching her for a moment. Under the lamplight, her face was small, her eyelashes long, and the tip of her nose was slightly red. Had she been crying? He wasn't sure. She always cried silently, without making a sound. He reached out and brushed the stray strands of hair from her forehead, tucking them behind her ear. Revenge. He moved his lips silently. Who would want to take revenge on you? He stood up, walked to the window, and dialed a number. Ryan, have you figured out the equity changes over at the Xia Group? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mr. Jake, is it convenient for you right now? Go ahead. Last week, the Xia Group quietly pledged the equity of 3 of its subsidiaries, with the financing directed toward the Jiang Group's supply chain. If they get enough leverage, they could choke us off on raw material procurement next quarter. Jake's gaze turned cold. Keep investigating. I need to know the exact amount of the pledge, who the financier is, and... He glanced back at the person sleeping soundly in the bed. What role Mrs. Eleanor played in all of this? Yes. He hung up the phone. The moonlight outside the window was bright. He stood there, his shadow stretching long. Stella turned over, pulling the blanket tighter around herself, like a small curled-up animal. He walked back and tucked the corner of the blanket in. Jake had just returned from overseas 3 years ago to take over the Jiang Group, and by then Stella had already been mute for over half a year. The Xia family only told outsiders that she was unwell and needed rest. He had asked around through connections, but all he got were watertight, official responses. At that time, his foundation was still unstable, and with the layers of barriers from the Xia family, he could only keep this score in his heart. On the 3rd day after their marriage, Jake began to bully her. Breakfast time. On the table were congee, xilongbao, fried eggs, and a small plate of shredded pork stir-fried with green peppers. Stella sat across from him, her face scrunching up the moment she saw the green peppers. She signed, I don't eat green peppers. Jake picked up a piece of green pepper with his chopsticks and placed it in her bowl. She signed again, I don't eat them. Eat. She glared at him. He leaned back in his chair, leisurely sipping his porridge, as if he hadn't noticed her stare. She pushed the bowl away. He pushed it back. She pushed it away again, and he pushed it back once more. The chopsticks lightly tapped twice against the rim of the bowl, a silent tug-of-war. After 2 rounds, Stella's face flushed with anger as she grabbed the chopsticks and smacked them on the table. Thud. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough to convey her fury. Jake looked up at her. You're anemic, he said. His tone as flat as if he were reading a report. Green peppers are high in iron. Eat. She froze for a moment. Then she lowered her head and ate the green peppers, bite by bite. She ate them with a look of grievance, her cheeks puffed out like a rabbit forced to eat carrots. Jake watched her, the corner of his mouth twitching upward before he pressed it back down. 10 o'clock at night. Stella was curled up on the sofa reading a comic, a blanket draped over her feet, a glass of warm milk beside her, appearing there at some point without her noticing. She was just getting to the exciting part. The male lead was about to confess. A hand reached over and snatched the manga away. She looked up. Jake stood behind the sofa, holding her manga in his hand, his face expressionless. She signed, Give it back. It's 10 o'clock. I haven't finished reading yet. Go to sleep. She jumped up from the sofa in anger, reaching for the comic book. He held it higher. She couldn't reach it. She stood on tiptoe. He was still far too tall for her. She stomped hard on his foot. He didn't move. His expression even seemed a little pleased. Done stomping? He asked. Go to sleep. She glared at him, her eyes reddening again. Not because she was about to cry, but out of sheer anger. He placed the comic book on the highest shelf, a spot she couldn't reach even with a stool. Read it tomorrow, he said. Now sleep. She stood there, her chest heaving like an agitated cat. Then she turned around, shoved the bedroom door open with a bang, stepped inside, and slammed it shut behind her. Jake stood in the living room, listening to the sound of pillows being thrown inside, and couldn't help but laugh. The next day, when Ryan came to report on work, he couldn't resist adding a comment. Mr. Jake, did you snatch Madam's manga again last night? She was signing with Gina for a long time today. I couldn't understand it, but Gina didn't look too happy. What did she say? Gina said, "The lady called you a big meanie." Jake's hand, flipping through the documents, paused for a moment. What else? And also, just you wait. The corner of Jake's mouth lifted. All right, he said. I'll wait. Ryan watched his boss's expression and silently offered a prayer for the lady of the house. Your fighting power is nothing more than a tickle in Mr. Jake's presence. But what Ryan didn't know was that in the drawer of Jake's study lay a medical report. Stella's anemia, mild malnutrition, sleep disorder, psychogenic mutism. Behind each item, he had handwritten a corresponding solution. Anemia, green peppers, pork liver, red dates. Malnutrition, adjust diet, 5 meals a day. Sleep disorder, must fall asleep before 10 o'clock. Psychogenic mutism, contact the best speech therapist. Ryan didn't know that Jake woke up half an hour earlier than Stella every morning, personally going to the kitchen to check the nutritional balance of her breakfast. He also didn't know that the comic books that had been snatched away would be quietly returned to their original spot on the sofa the next day, with the bookmark placed at the page she had been reading the night before. Things were also moving forward on the business front. Ryan placed a file on the desk. Mr. Jake, we've traced the financing party for the Xia family's pledged shares. It's Shanghua Capital. Jake flipped open the file, his gaze sweeping over a few lines of numbers before stopping. The actual controller of Shanghua, he said softly, is Mrs. Eleanor's younger brother? Yes, Mrs. Eleanor's younger brother, Zane, indirectly holds 12% of the Xia family's shares through Shanghua. This pledged financing is essentially an internal asset shuffle within the Xia family. They're preparing for the upcoming board restructuring. Who's the target? Zhang Group's leverage in the supply chain. If they secure enough bargaining chips, they could raise raw material procurement prices by 30% next quarter. Jake closed the file. 30%. That figure alone could slash Zhang Group's profit margins in half. They think, Jake stood up and walked to the window, that by marrying their mute daughter, I'd docilely play the part of a son-in-law? Ryan dared not respond. Keep watching. Also, he paused. Look into the real reason Stella lost her voice 3 years ago. 3 years ago? The official story is psychological trauma, but I don't buy it. He turned around, his gaze cold as ice. The Xia family's public explanation is too perfect. So perfect it sounds fabricated. The Speech Rehabilitation Center was in the eastern part of the city, a 40-minute drive from Zhang Group headquarters. Jake left the office at 3 o'clock sharp every Tuesday and Friday afternoon, without fail. Ryan initially tried to remind him tactfully, Mr. Jake, there's a supplier meeting on Tuesday afternoon. Reschedule it. But the other party is. I said reschedule it. From then on, no one ever brought it up again. The rehabilitation room was small, with diagrams of the vocal organs posted on the walls and a small mirror placed on the table. Stella sat in the chair, facing the rehabilitation therapist, Dr. Sarah. Jake sat on the sofa nearby, legs crossed, holding a magazine that hadn't moved past the 3rd page, his eyes fixed on her the whole time. Come on, Miss Stella. Let's try once more. Dr. Sarah's voice was gentle. Take a deep breath, then making a sound. Simple, just like sighing. Stella took a deep breath. She opened her mouth. No sound came out. Her throat moved. Her vocal cords vibrated. But the sound simply wouldn't come out. Like a rusted shut door, you push, but it doesn't budge. Dr. Sarah didn't rush her. She just nodded gently. It's okay. Let's try again. A second time. A third time. A fourth time. Still silent. Stella's hands began to tremble. She lowered her head, her fingers gripping the hem of her skirt. Dr. Sarah glanced at Jake. Jake put down the magazine, walked over, and crouched down in front of her. Look at me. She didn't lift her head. Stella, look at me. She raised her head, her eyes rimmed with red, her lips pressed into a thin line. He reached out and took her hand. Her hand was ice cold. When you used to teach me how to read, he said. his voice so soft that only the two of them could hear. If I wrote a character wrong, you'd tap my head and say, "You're hopeless, try again." Her eyelashes fluttered. "Now," he squeezed her fingers. "I'm telling you the same thing. You're hopeless, try again." She glared at him, a single tear falling. He reached out and wiped it away. "What are you crying for? When you're done crying, we'll continue." She sniffled, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath. Ah, a faint sound, as thin as a mosquito's hum. Dr. Sarah's eyes lit up. Jake didn't smile, but his grip on her hand tightened slightly. Again. Ah, a little louder than before. Again. Ah. The voice was still hoarse, broken, as if coming from a very, very distant place. But it was a voice, her first voice in 3 years. Stella opened her eyes, looking at Dr. Sarah in disbelief, then at Jake. His face showed no expression as he stood up, brushing the dust off his knees. "Let's go," he said. "We'll continue next week." As she walked out of the rehabilitation center, she was ahead of him when she suddenly stopped, turned around, and signed. "Thank you." He glanced at her, said nothing, reached out to press her head, turned her back around, and pushed her forward. Cut the crap. On the way back, she leaned against the car window and fell asleep. Jake watched her for a moment, then reached for a blanket from the back seat and draped it over her. Then he made a call. "Found anything?" Ryan's voice came through the phone, tinged with hesitation. "Mr. Jake, about what happened 3 years ago. I found it. There was indeed trouble within the Xia family. Zane, Mrs. Eleanor's younger brother, had tried to seize control of the Xia Corporation back then, and Miss Stella sided with her mother. To force Miss Stella to give in, Zane had her placed under house arrest for half a month. Jake's fingers tightened. In half a month, Zane cut off all her contact with the outside world. He confiscated her phone, forbade her from seeing anyone, and only gave her 1 meal a day. Miss Stella stopped speaking from the 3rd day, not because she couldn't, but because she wouldn't. After she was rescued, she never opened her mouth again. The car was silent for a long time. Half a month. Jake's voice was flat as a stagnant pool of water. Her uncle locked her up for half a month. Yes, and, for the sake of family dignity, Mrs. Eleanor didn't call the police or handle it publicly. She simply told outsiders that Miss Stella was unwell and needed rest. Her mother knew. She knew. She knew she was locked up for half a month, knew she lost her voice because of it, and then chose to keep the family's dirty laundry hidden. Yes. Jake closed his eyes. Outside the car window, the city lights sped backward. He thought back to when they were kids. He was 11 that year and she was 10. After school, a few older boys cornered him, trying to snatch the pocket money from his backpack. His mother worked as a maid for the Xia family, and the school uniform he wore was a hand-me-down from the Xia kids. Those boys thought he was an easy target. He didn't give in. They shoved him and he fell to the ground. Then Stella charged over. She was a head shorter than those boys, but she threw a punch straight at the nose of the one in front. Blood splattered, and the boy froze, giving her a chance to kick him. "He's mine!" She stood in front of him, arms spread wide like a mother hen protecting her chick. "No one touches him." The boys, intimidated by her fierce stance, grumbled and walked away. She turned around and crouched down to look at him. His knee was scraped and bleeding. She pulled a crumpled band-aid from her pocket and pressed it onto his knee. It was crooked, so she peeled it off and reapplied it. "Does it hurt?" she asked. He shook his head. "Liar!" She glared at him. "You're bleeding. How could it not hurt?" He didn't say a word. She stood up, dusted off her hands, and grabbed his wrist. "Come on. I'll treat you to an ice pop." That day, she bought him a mung bean ice pop. Hers melted before she could finish it, mung bean juice dripping onto her dress. She didn't seem to mind, licking it as she said, "Jake, you need to get stronger in the future, so no one can bully you." He asked, "What about you?" "Me?" She took a bite of the ice pop and mumbled, "I'll protect you." She protected him. And then she was hurt by her own family, with no one to protect her. Jake opened his eyes and glanced at Stella, who was fast asleep. Her brows were slightly furrowed, her sleep restless. He reached out and gently smoothed the crease between her brows. "You don't have to protect me anymore," he said silently. "Let me take over." That night she spoke. It happened all of a sudden. Jake was in the study handling documents, while Stella was in the living room watching a documentary about the ocean. She loved watching the sea. The study door was left slightly ajar, allowing him to hear the narration from the TV. Then the TV sound stopped. He glanced at the time, 5 minutes to 10. She was being sensible today, not waiting for him to come and take it away. He continued with the documents. About 10 minutes later, he heard a sound. Very faint. So faint it felt like an illusion. "Jake!" His pen stopped. He thought he had misheard. "Jake!" There it was again. A little clearer than the first time. Hoarse, broken, as if it was being forced out bit by bit from deep within her throat. He stood up, his chair sliding backward and hitting the wall. He didn't care. He walked out of the study. The lights in the living room were already off, with only the faint blue glow of the TV screen illuminating the space. Stella stood in the middle of the room, her hands clenched against her chest, her entire body trembling. She was practicing. She had been practicing all along. When she saw him come out, her body stiffened for a moment, but her lips kept moving. "Jake!" This time it was clearer than the previous 2 attempts. Though still hoarse, like sandpaper scraping against wood, the word was complete, distinct, and real. Jake stood there, motionless. She looked at him nervously, her eyes filled with anxiety, as if waiting for a verdict. He walked over, each step faster than the last. Then he crouched down, cupping her face in both hands. Her tears fell. "Say it again." His voice was hoarse. "Jake!" He lifted her up. Not a cautious embrace, but a full lift, raising her above his head and spinning her around. Startled, she grabbed his shoulders as tears and laughter spilled out together. Her laughter was hoarse and broken, but she was laughing. He was spinning. The living room wasn't big. After 3 spins, they hit the sofa and tumbled onto it together. He ended up on the bottom. She sprawled across his chest, both of them gasping for air. "You!" She spoke, her voice like a rusty door hinge. "What are you doing? Say it again. Jake! Say it again. Jake!" He closed his eyes, his arms tightening as he pressed her against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat. It was fast, unnaturally fast. "Jake!" she said again, this time with a hint of confusion. "Are you crying?" He wasn't. Okay, her eyes were red, but she didn't cry. "No." She reached out and touched his face. When her fingertips brushed the corner of his eye, it was wet. "Liar," she said, her voice hoarse as if her mouth were full of sand. But her tone was unmistakably that of the willful little princess from childhood. "You were crying." He took her hand, brought it to his lips, and kissed it. "Revenge," he said, his voice so low that only by pressing against his chest could it be heard. "Was never anything more than an excuse." She was stunned. "I've waited for you for 10 years, he said. "Waiting for you to call my name again." Moonlight streamed in through the window, falling upon them. The next morning at the John Group board meeting, Jake sat at the head of the table, an acquisition proposal spread out before him. "Ladies and gentlemen, regarding the 12% stake in Xia Corporation held by Shanghua Capital." He flipped open the document. "I have completed the acquisition." The conference room fell silent for 2 seconds, then erupted. A director abruptly stood up. "Mr. Jake, where did the acquisition funds come from? This is completely outside the annual budget." Jake raised a hand to stop him, tapping a line of small text on the file cover with his other finger. "John Group Overseas Investment Line, an independent capital pool established 3 years ago, not drawing from the group budget." The conference room erupted in murmurs. Some flipped through documents, others whispered to each other. Furthermore, Jake continued, his voice as calm as if he were commenting on the weather, I have renegotiated the pledged financing for 3 subsidiaries under the Xia Group. Shanghua Capital has withdrawn its investment, and the pledges have been lifted. He pushed forward a sealed agreement, with Shenghua's withdrawal letter clipped to the first page. Ryan stood to the side, watching the expressions of the directors seated around the table. Priceless. It was like having a pot of cold boiled water forced down their throats, leaving them sober and chilled to the bone. So that means, the oldest director spoke slowly, the Xia family's leverage over the Jiang Group's supply chain no longer exists. Jake closed the file. From today onward, the Xia family has no say in the Jiang Group. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. Meeting adjourned. In the afternoon, Eleanor arrived. She sat on the sofa in Jake's office, her well-maintained face betraying little emotion, but the knuckles of her fingers gripping the teacup were white. Jake, she said, what is the meaning of this? Exactly what it says. You married my daughter, yet. I married your daughter, Jake interrupted her. Not the commercial bargaining chip of the Xia family. Eleanor's mouth twitched. You think I don't know? Jake leaned against the edge of the desk, looking down at her. 3 years ago, Zane locked Stella up for half a month. You knew. You chose to keep the family's dirty laundry hidden. Eleanor's face changed color. She's been mute for 3 years because of that incident. Jake's voice dropped low, but every word struck like a nail. 3 years. You think family dignity is more important than her. I don't blame you, that's your choice. But from today onward, her matters are mine to decide. I've already taken over the Xia Group's shares. Shanghua Capital has withdrawn its investment, and the pledge has been lifted. As for your brother Zane's position in the Xia Group, I suggest you deal with it as soon as possible. Otherwise, he let out a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. I wouldn't mind handling it for him. Eleanor stood up, her finger pointing at Jake, her lips trembling for a long moment. In the end, she said nothing. She turned and walked away. After the door closed, Ryan emerged from the corner with a complicated expression. Mr. Jake, isn't this a bit too harsh? Jake shot him a glance. Her brother locked Stella up for half a month, he said. Letting him lose his position is already being lenient. After Stella discovered her voice had returned, she completely transformed. It didn't happen all at once, but like ice melting in spring. First the cracks, then the trickle of water, and finally the whole river coming alive. Her voice was still hoarse, and she spoke slowly, sometimes repeating a word 2 or 3 times before she could say it clearly. But she didn't mind. She had so much she wanted to say. The first victim was Jake. In the morning, she refused to get out of bed. Jake knocked 3 times at the door. It's 10 o'clock. Before, she would have obediently gotten up. But now, no. A hoarse voice came from under the covers. Jake's hand paused on the doorknob. I still want to sleep. She wrapped the blanket tighter, leaving only her eyes visible. Come in and hold me. He stood at the door, his expression unchanged, but the tips of his ears turned red. Stella. You weren't like this before. Before I was mute, she said matter-of-factly. Now I'm not. So hold me. He walked over, bent down, and scooped her up along with the blanket. She nestled in his arms, contentedly rubbing against his chest. A little tighter. Give him an inch and he'll take a mile. She looked up at him, her eyes curving into crescents. You spoiled me. Blow-drying her hair was the same. After she finished showering, her damp hair draped over her shoulders. She plopped down on the sofa and shoved the hairdryer into his hand. Blow-dry it. Can't you do it yourself? My arm is sore. You were just playing on your phone a moment ago. That's different, she said seriously. Playing on the phone is entertainment. Drying my hair is work. He looked at her, thinking the logic was absurd, yet somehow not entirely wrong. He turned on the hairdryer, and warm air rushed out with a hum. She closed her eyes, savoring it like a cat being petted. His fingers ran through her hair, his movements gentle, afraid of tugging. Jake! Your hair-drying skills are better than Gina's. Thanks for the compliment. You'll do it from now on. He didn't say it was good, nor did he say it was bad. But the next day, when she came out of the shower, the hairdryer was already plugged in and placed on the sofa. The movie-watching incident was the worst. She picked a romance film. Not one with a plot, but the kind that was purely sweet from start to finish, where the male lead kept cornering the female lead against the wall. Jake sat beside her, watching expressionlessly for 20 minutes. Are you sure you want to watch this? Sure. These kinds of movies. They're good. She leaned closer to him. Don't you think the male lead looks like you? How so? Both seem cold on the surface, but actually spoil their wives like crazy. He fell silent. On the screen, the male lead was chasing the female lead in the rain, pouring out his heartfelt confession. Look! She pointed at the screen. He caught up. If it were you, would you chase after me? No. Why not? Because you can't escape. She glared at him, but couldn't suppress the smile tugging at her lips. The most nerve-wracking time was when she recorded a confession. She somehow dug out a phone stand from somewhere, set it up on the coffee table, and aimed it at the sofa. Jake, come sit over here. What's up? Recording something. He sat down beside her. She leaned against his shoulder, facing the camera, her face as red as a boiled shrimp. Go on, he urged her. Aren't you going to record? She took a deep breath, looked into the camera, and said, word by word, in that hoarse voice, I, Stella, like Jake. After saying that, she buried her face in his shoulder, the tips of her ears turning red. He looked down at her and reached out to ruffle her hair. Done recording? Then it's my turn. He reached over and took the phone, holding it up to himself, and said with a deadpan expression, I, Jake, have only ever liked one person since I was 10 years old. He put the phone back. She bounced up from his shoulder, eyes wide. You were 10 years old when you stepped on my hand back then, he said. And after stepping on it, you said you'd protect me. Tach, that's because you look so fierce, he said, looking at her, the corners of his mouth finally curling up. It's especially beautiful. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out, and she buried her face again. Ryan later secretly asked Jake, Mr. Jake, isn't the lady a bit too clingy to you now? Too clingy. It's just, she used to be quiet, but now she acts spoiled every day, even ordering you to blow-dry her hair. Ryan. Yes. You're single, aren't you? Yes. Then shut up. On a summer evening, the breeze drifted in from the balcony, carrying the scent of gardenias. Stella leaned against Jake's shoulder, holding a glass of iced lemonade, the straw bitten out of shape. Jake. You know, everyone thinks you married me for the Xia family's power and wealth. Then what exactly are you doing this for? He didn't answer, just looked down at her. She tilted her face up, eyes bright, lips curved into a smile, but with a hint of seriousness in her gaze. He thought for a moment, to get revenge for something from childhood. She glared at him. He laughed. You pushed me into the mud, stepped on my hand, forced me to eat your leftover popsicle, and called me Little Mute. He counted off one by one. That debt needs to be settled slowly. Have you settled it yet? She asked, her voice hoarse but syrupy sweet. No, he said, pulling her a little closer. So it'll never be settled in this lifetime. She smiled, wrapped her arms around his waist, and pressed her cheek against his chest. Jake. You won't be able to escape for the rest of your life. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against the top of her hair. Escape? He said, his voice low and laced with laughter. Madam, that's exactly what I've been hoping for. The gardenia on the balcony had bloomed across the entire tree, its fragrance carried far and wide by the evening breeze. She closed her eyes, listening to the beat of his heart. When he was 10 years old, She stepped on the back of his hand and said, "I'll protect you." He waited 15 years, finally hearing her say his name once more. This time it was his turn to protect her. Forever.